Today is May 5th, 2009. I am Andrea Mott. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Fargo, North Dakota. Can you please state your full name?
Margaret Magdalena Bitz.
When and where were you born?
I was born on a farm in Logan County, south of Napoleon, North Dakota.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
The one thing I remember is that the day after I was born, I was taken to church to be baptized. And my father said I was a good baby.
Was a midwife or doctor present at that time?
Yes, my grandmother was the midwife.
Please share some of your earliest memories with us.
Oh, okay. I remember when I was 4 years old, one of my most vivid memories then was at the farm. We were living at my grandfather's farm, and my grandfather had lost the farm as a result of the recession, and the sheriff drove up into the yard, and my father and my two older brothers were out in the farm, outside with my dad at the windmill, and Mom and my sister and I were inside. And I still remember that picture, just everything sort of stopping and looking outside. And apparently, you know, there was something said because it made such a vivid impression on me, and that's one of my first memories. And then another memory, when we lived at that farm at that time, we used to play outside in the chicken feed containers, and so I remember doing that, and living not far from an uncle and aunt, a quarter of a mile, and sometimes we would run to my uncle's place and play with my cousins there.
What was it like growing up on a farm?
It was great, and we did not have to be entertained. We entertained ourselves. We had lots of place to run, and I grew up with a lot of brothers and sisters, so we were always, always had somebody to play with.
What kind of games did you play with your siblings?
We had a number of games, and during the week we didn't so much play organized games, but on the weekend, when Sundays we were not farming, not working, so then on weekends we would play softball, and Mom and Dad would play with us. And we said I had enough brothers that they could make a team all their own. There were 9 boys in the family. So, but then we would play hide and go seek. We would play kick the can.
What is kick the can?
It sort of is like hide and go seek. Somebody kicks the can and then you run and hide, and then somebody has to come and look for you so it works the same as hide and go seek.
So hide and seek and kick the can, were there any other games that you played at the farm?
Okay, I have a booklet with with the instructions written down for the games. And I remember games we played at school. We played Pum Pum Pull Away, and we played Steal the Sticks.
What is Steal the Sticks?
You choose 2 sides, and each side has a bunch of sticks, and you would try to steal the sticks from the other team, but if they tagged you before you got the stick, then you had to be on their side. And then, so the goal of the game was to steal all the sticks from the other team without getting caught.
What other kind of games did you play at school? Were those just outside, or did you have?
Those were outside. During the school year, and some of the years, we had some really interesting teachers who allowed us to play different games indoors. And I remember one year, we brought all of our old vegetable cans and cereal boxes and whatever else to school to play store. And then the teacher would bring, the kind of pad that the grocer would use in writing up the groceries. And so we would write up the groceries that people were buying. So we played store and, about as close to being real as could be for kids.
Now, how many people did you have in your school?
When I started out, I was the only one there was somebody else in the first grade with me, but he was kept back. So I was the only one in my grade all through grade school. But there were about 18 or 20 students, and then every year there were fewer and fewer students in the country school.
Were a lot of those your siblings?
Yes, and then there were always about 5 or 6 others, neighbor children, neighbor kids.
Now, what was your favorite subject in school?
Reading, language arts, spelling, reading. In fact, I think I read every book. We had a library, a small library, and I think I had read every book by the time I was in 5th grade. And I was always reading when I shouldn't have been, when I was supposed to be doing my homework, my math, and my geography, or whatever else.
What was your favorite book?
Oh, I don't remember a particular favorite book. In those days, they didn't have Laura Wilder Ingalls yet. I just remember in 7th and 8th grade, we had a list of books that we were required reading. And Call It Courage, I remember, was one of them.
Did you do any extracurricular activities at school, or did you just go home afterwards?
All I remember as far as extracurricular activities at Christmas time, some of the years, 2 of the years, we put on Christmas plays. Otherwise, we didn't have anything extra. Or I should say, in 1949, our teacher took us to Bismarck for our picnic, and we were featured on KFYR radio. And our teacher was an aunt of mine, and she was a songwriter, or she made up songs, and so she had made up a song for the occasion. And so we sang that song on KFYR radio.
Do you remember the song?
Yes, and we still sing it, those of us who went to school at that time.
Is there any, would you mind singing it now?
I'm not a good enough singer. The title of it was We'll Remember This School Year. And the teacher was Ella Schwarzenberger.
Now, you mentioned Christmas plays. Do you remember any in particular that you were participating in?
I don't remember what the name of the play was, what it was about. I just remember hauling in 2 old barn doors to make a stage, and using bed sheets for a curtain that could be drawn, a stage curtain. But I don't remember the topic of the play.
And was it a yearly?
No, it just happened. We had 2 teachers who did that, and that's the only time we ever did that. Again, it was when my aunt was the teacher. She was creative, and then another one of the teachers did it.
Did you ever go on any other field trips other than the one to Bismarck?
We used to attend the yearly Young Citizens League that was held in town, where all the country schools came together. And then we would sing for that. Each school had their little part in that program.
Can you describe what kind of league that is? What they did?
I don't have any idea. I just know it was a way of bringing country schools together with the town school.
Now, country schools, did you attend was it a one-room schoolhouse?
It was a one-room schoolhouse, right.
Can you picture that in your mind and describe it?
It had a small entryway, which was also a place where the wood for the wood-burning stove was kept. And it had some hooks in the back on which we would hang our clothes, our outer coats, and kept our boots. And also we brought our lunches to school in syrup buckets, and we would keep those buckets back there. And there was a crate on which we had a hand-washing dish, and we had a container in which we kept water, so we would wash our hands in that. There was a wood-burning stove in the center of the classroom that the teacher would stoke in the morning, and then when we needed to put more wood in, she'd add more wood. And there was also coal that we used. In fact, most of it was coal burning, because we had a coal shed out behind the school, and would use that for heating schoolroom. And as far as I remember, I think we only had 4 windows in the schoolhouse, so it was not that big of a schoolhouse. Just
how far did you have to walk?
We lived 1.5 miles from school, and we did walk in spring and in fall. And then in the winter, when the roads were blocked, then my dad would take us on a sled with the horses. And even on days when it was stormy or very cold, he'd put hay in the bottom of the sled, and then we'd sit in that, and then he'd cover us with what we call the horse blanket. And he would wear his big sheepskin coat with the collar up and the cap with the ear laps, and then just let the horses lead the way. The horses knew where to go. And then he would pick us up again after school. And I remember one time when it was a stormy day at the end of the school day, the neighbors got lost in the storm. And then the horses, they just sort of stopped there and wouldn't go any farther until the blizzard stopped. And then the horses knew where they were, and then they finished the trip back home. But we were concerned about them. I know my dad was concerned, because he just gave the horses free rein, and the horses took us home. And I don't know if the neighbor did that, or maybe the snow was too deep. I don't know.
Now, was that a typical winter for you and your family?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, can you describe what a typical spring would have been like?
At school?
At school?
Or at home, or...
On the farm? How about on the farm? What was a typical spring like on the farm?
Okay, I know, it was seeding time, and so Dad, the first couple of years, Dad would do some seeding with the horses. We didn't have a tractor right away from the beginning, so he'd be out there with the horses plowing, and with the press drill attached to the plow. Maybe that was afterwards when we came with the tractor. But he'd be out there plowing with the horses, and disking with the horses, and then seeding. And then later on, when he planted corn, they'd be out cultivating regularly to keep the weeds down in the cornfield. And my brothers, were involved in that right from the beginning, and there was a lot of rock hauling every spring, because every spring, with the plowing, new rocks would be dug up with the plowing. So we needed new rock picking, and we had what we called a stone boat. It was just a flat piece of equipment that horses would pull. It had, and then we would. I never helped pick rocks, but my brothers, they would run alongside and throw the rocks on that stone boat, and then they had to haul it to a rock pile and push it off again.
And what kind of crops did your family
rye and barley and wheat and oats. Those were the primary, and flax, primary crops. And then later on we started planting corn, and then still later alfalfa for hay.
How about animals? What kind of animals did your family raise?
We had cows and pigs, chickens, and my brother was one that was always experimenting with new kinds of animals. So he would raise turkeys, he raised ducks, and he raised geese.
And which brother was this?
Al. His real name is Longinus, and we did call him that growing up, but he's now known by Al.
Now, how about inside the house? Did you and your sisters help your mother? What was the typical day like inside the house?
Making breakfast, and then of course going to school, and then coming home from school. We'd have to make supper, and we'd iron clothes, and we'd scrub. And Saturdays we'd wash down the walls and scrub the kitchen chairs. We still laugh about that, you know. Oh yes, we had to wash down those walls every weekend.
What did that consist of when you washed the walls? What was?
It was just a bucket of water and a rag, and then just wash, you know, the dirt from the finger marks that all the kids made. And then later on, we started cooking and helping with the cooking, and Mom would make bread 3 times a week at least, bake bread, and every time she did, she would bake about 12 loaves. And my sister and I, especially my sister, even though she was younger than me, she started making bread, I think already in the 6th grade. She would start kneading the dough, mix the dough and knead, and then make bread. And one time I remember my younger brother grabbed a loaf of bread that had just been freshly baked, and he ran out of the house. And when it came supper time, we couldn't find him. And here we found him in a wagon. He had fallen asleep eating out the inside of this loaf of bread. So
which brother was that?
That was Willie. We still tease him about that. Yeah, when he eats bread, he eats a whole loaf of bread.
Now, what other kinds of meals did your mother make that you remember?
In spring, we had or early summer, we had fresh chicken regularly, because we would raise chickens. We'd order them in spring, and then and I have a picture of that, where we would help, and we learned early. My sister Cecilia and I learned early to help, helping butcher chickens. And then in the fall, we would butcher hogs, and then we would preserve them in brine in a barrel over the winter. And so during the winter months, we would have pork and potatoes and sauerkraut, or pork chops, or pork sausage. And sometimes my mother would can chicken, and so we would have canned chicken during the winter months then.
Now, did she can anything else besides chicken?
We did have a garden, and she did can beans, and she made some sauerkraut, but not too much of that. We just had pickles. She would, can pickles.
Now, what was the process for canning?
She, with the pickles, I remember just putting the pickles into a jar, and then making a pickle juice using pickling spices, and then the dill, and then of course some garlic. And then we would heat that in what we call a hot bath. And then after it boiled so long, we take it out and turn it upside down with sealing the lids.
Now, how long did that usually take?
Like how many hours, how many days? I think like it would, when we would do pickles, she'd pick cucumbers in the morning, and then we would do that in the afternoon. So that would take an afternoon. And then different days when we time to pick them again, it would take time, several afternoons spread out over the growing season of cucumbers.
Now, did your family regularly make desserts for meals? Or?
No, we had dessert only on Sundays, and that would usually be a homemade chocolate cake, and then maybe canned peaches, store-bought canned peaches.
Did your mother have a garden?
Yes, we did. And it was, we raised potatoes and cabbage and lettuce and carrots and radishes, onions, some very just staple kind of foods. Mm-hmm.
Now, how about chores? Did you and your siblings split chores, or were you assigned specific ones?
When we were young, I don't remember any, but we did start helping with the milking early on. By the time we were 6 years old, we all helped with the milking and with gathering eggs and feeding the chickens and feeding the hogs. And when it was milking time, or after the milking, we would do the separating. And then after the separating, we girls washed the separator and the milk pails. And we'd help feed the calves after the separating afterwards, too. So the boys would mostly help Dad in the fields or whatever needed to be done. And but we all helped with the milking, hand milking.
Now, how many siblings did you have?
15. 10 brothers and 5 sisters.
What was it like growing up in a large family?
It was never boring. We were not bored. We always had something to do. If it wasn't work, it was, playing. I know in the wintertime we did a lot of sledding. We had a large hill on the land, which was about 1/8 of a mile from the house, and we'd do, sledding down that hill. And it was the craziest. So at the bottom of that hill was a barbed wire fence, and it was amazing we didn't get killed running under that barbed wire fence, going down the hill on our sleds.
Now, what other kind of activities did you and your siblings usually partake in?
There was a lot of, we had different ponies or horses, so there was horseback riding. And we had a lot of cousins who lived in town, so they spent a lot of time out at the farm at our place. And so making our own toys. I remember my brother, he was one who would always be making toys out of blocks of wood, and Vincent, and he'd always swipe Dad's tools from his tool shed to shape the toys that he was making. And he'd always, if a tool was missing, Dad knew that Vincent had taken it. So that's one of the things we did. And the cousins, it was just running around and just, playing, nothing really to play with, and yet just always either with the horses or just doing, what did you do, just running around, or playing hide and go seek, or playing tricks on each other.
Did you ever stay with your cousins in town?
Not very often, no. And a lot of them would come to the farm too when the parents would come to help butcher. And in fact, some of the aunts and uncles would buy some hogs from us, and then we would butcher their hogs and our hogs, and then everybody would help with the butchering.
Now, what was a day like when you did the butchering?
Butchering. It was a full day. You know, Dad and the men would kill the pigs and scrape the hide of the pigs, scrape the hair off. They had to dunk them in hot water to get the hair off. And then they would cut it up and bring it into the house, and then they'd grind up the meat for sausage, or cut the ham for putting in the brine, and then we'd have a cook stove in the basement, and all the lard that they cut off, Mom would, what do you call it, with the lard, brine, rendering the lard from the fat of the hogs, but spending a lot of time. And then we would eat, you know, whatever, like that day, a day of butchering, we would eat the liver and the brain of the pig, and what they call that now is tripe, and that's a delicacy in you know, fine restaurants. And then the tongue of the pig, we like that. And then I remember Mom and my aunts cleaning the intestines of the pig for making sausage casings. They would be used for sausage. And then the brine barrels would be set up so the meat could be put into the barrels for preserving them for the winter. And then some of that we would smoke. We had a smokehouse, and so some of that would be smoked.
How many hogs was it? Was
Usually about three at a time, and that would take all day.
And how many aunts and uncles did you have that would come out and help?
I think it was between 3 or 4 different ones, and so sometimes we would do it at different times, and maybe 2 of them would come at one time and 2 of them another time.
Now, did your grandparents live near?
Well, when I was first born, we lived with my grandparents. I think I must have been about 3 or 4 when they moved to town. But before my time, my great-grandmother lived in the same house when my grandparents and my parents and my older brother lived in the house. And then later on, when my uncle got married, he also lived in the same house with my grandparents and my parents. And it was a small house. You look at it now and you see, where did they keep themselves?
Now, what age were you when you moved to your family farm?
I was 4 years old, or going on 5, pretty close to 5, yeah.
Can you describe your family farmhouse?
I never remember the size of it, but my brother knows it, and it was really a small house, and my uncle built it. Well, when we moved on the farm, it was there was a house there, but it was leaky, and it was no basement underneath. It was just a dirt hole basement. And we slept in the upstairs, but it was leaking, and so we'd have to set buckets on the floor if it rained. And in the winter it was cold, so Mom and Dad would heat up some rocks in the wood-burning stove, and then put them in bed with us at night to warm the bed, and then we'd have feather tick to cover us there. But then later on, my uncle, who was a carpenter, built a house, and he wanted just a simple house. My mother wanted dormers on the house. He didn't want to put dormers or gables on the house. It was too complicated. So my mother did not get the house she wanted. And even that house was small for 16 of us. Really small house. We had a girl's bedroom and we had a boy's bedroom. And the boys had 3 beds in their bedroom. And when the cousins came, my cousin says, you know, yeah, we slept 4 to a bed, 2 on the head end and 2 on the foot end, so you had somebody's feet in your face. But
was it the same for you and your sisters?
well, there were only few of, you know, it's just a couple of us girls, so it wasn't quite as bad. But the little ones, even the little boys, slept with us then until they were about 2 or 3 years old. And then it was just a large kitchen with a large table, because we had to sit around. We had to have room for everybody to sit around that table. And then Mom's bedroom and Dad in a living room. And we did have a refrigerator quite early, because even though we didn't have REA, which came later on, which was rural electrification, we did have a battery operated system where we had our own electricity on the farm. So we did have electricity earlier than most other farmers around there did. I guess my dad was quite an innovator, an entrepreneur, and so we did have. And then he dug a well for us too, so we had a well because of the electricity, we could also, you know, run our own, have running water, which other farmers didn't have right away. But I do remember at the time, yet before we even got the electricity, we did keep our foods cool by keeping them in a pail and putting them in the bottom of the well. You know, we had a windmill, and then that was setting on a dugout hole, and there was water in that hole, and it was always cold water from the windmill, you know, pulling it up. And so we kept our butter and our milk and our cream in that well to keep it cool.
Did you have a cellar in addition to using?
We had a root cellar, right, and that's where we kept our potatoes. And we did keep our cream, and we'd separate, and then we'd sell our cream, and we kept our cream can in the root cellar, and we would sell that weekly. And then the money from selling that cream is what Mom used for buying groceries that week. And I still remember we would get $16 for a can of cream, and that paid for the groceries for that week. You know, nowadays, you can't get anything for $16. And she would buy cereal, cornflakes, and it was Kellogg's cornflakes. And we got so used to Kellogg's cornflakes that if you bought anything else, nobody would eat it. Post cornflakes, nobody would eat Post cornflakes. And sugar and flour were the main staples that were purchased, you know, for making bread and whatever else you needed with the sugar. And then I remember during the rationing period during the war, I remember we had rationing stamps for buying foods, for buying sugar, and for buying shoes, I remember particularly.
Now, how would your mother take any of you with her on her shopping trips?
Generally not. Although when we got to be 7 or older, we did. Some of us could go along. We had, you know, 1 week one of us would go, and the next week somebody else would go along to town. But otherwise, it was mostly Mom and Dad, and they would, you know, would buy the groceries, and Dad did whatever he had to do in town, business.
Can you describe your dad?
Dad was always tall and thin. At least that's how I always pictured him as a child. He was a hard worker, And he was demanding. I mean, you didn't say no to Dad. If Dad said jump, you jumped. And we would get lickings if we did things we weren't supposed to, or if we didn't obey, or if we didn't do what he told us. When he said come, you came. And Mom would just, we never got lickings from Mom, but we did from Dad. So Mom would just tell us to do something, although she'd have to get after us, a number of times before we did what she told us to do.
What do you remember best about your mom?
She was very exacting with her own self. Like when she washed a dish rag, she would wash and wash and wash the dish rag to get all the soap out. And if she folded the dish towels, she would fold them exactly so all the corners met. And when she'd wipe dishes, she would wipe and wipe and wipe, make sure she got them dry. But her cooking was always, again, the aunts and uncles and the cousins would come for dinner, and she'd always make sure she had enough food. And the one thing I remember especially about my mom, and I was already gone from home in high school. I went to a boarding school in high school. And during that time, the neighbors had to move out of their home, the farm, so they had no place to go. And so she took them in, husband and wife, along with 6 kids. And she fixed up the basement of the house, and they moved in their furniture, and they lived in the basement of our house. So she was always generous and always reaching out to help whoever might have needed help.
What do you remember best about your father?
As I mentioned, he was sort of an entrepreneur. He got the magazine Popular Mechanics, but then he also, I don't know where he got the idea, he ordered a suit making business kit. And with that kit, he would measure, if somebody wanted a suit, they would come to the house. And he would take the measurements, and there were samples in that kit, and then he would send that measurements in, and whatever kind of material and the kind of suit that the people had picked out with the samples that were in the kit. And then the suits were made, tailored suits, and then so Dad would get paid for doing that. And I think the suits cost like $30, and they were tailored suits. But so that was one of his way of making extra money. He did surveying for the government to make money. And the fact that he started that, set up that electrical battery system. And then he was also thoughtful of others, like I remember one time, and this was later on in life, but when people started going to Bismarck to buy cheaper groceries or cheaper things, and he would say, our people in our town have to make a living too, I buy my things in town. So that consciousness of being community and helping out with community. And Mom and Dad were both quite dedicated to the church and had a faith. I still remember during Lent, the roads were still blocked, or else they were so muddy you couldn't really drive. So early, and when everything was still frozen, Dad would drive the car to school. Then on Wednesday nights or Friday nights, when we had Stations of the Cross, we would take the wagon with the horses to the school, and from there we would take the car and drive to town with the car. And then during the winter sometimes we would go by horse and sled 9 miles to town to go to church. So going to church was important.
What was a typical service like?
Well, we were Catholics, so it was the Mass, but we had a German-speaking priest, and so he would give a homily in German sometimes, and then he'd give a homily in English. And in church, the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other side, and the children sat up in front, boys on one side and the girls on the other side, and parents could watch them from where they were, and if anybody misbehaved in church, they heard about it when they got home.
Did that ever happen in your family?
No, we knew we didn't take any chance like that. And then, yeah, and this priest, you know, he really was brimstone, hell, fire and brimstone kind of thing. But then after church on Sunday, we'd stop by at Grandpa and Grandma Bitz's house. That was just like part of the Sunday doing. And just once in a while, we would stop by at Grandpa and Grandma Schwarzenberger's house. But not every Sunday as regularly as we did with Grandpa and Grandma Bitz.
Now, what were your paternal grandparents like?
Grandpa Bitz was a short man. He didn't talk much, and I always found him to be a gentleman. Dad said he was really stern and strict, but I never saw that part of him. But Grandma Bitz, she was dominating kind of a woman. She would, and she dominated my mother. Of course, my mother didn't like that. And and then Grandpa Schwarzenberger, he died when I was 4 years old. He died of cancer. And he was easy-go-lucky and a man who liked to sing. And then Grandma Schwarzenberger, she was easygoing too.
Did you spend a lot of time with your maternal grandparents?
Not as such, but in the summer when we went to Bible school, or we called it sister school or vacation school, that was right across the street from where Grandpa and Grandma Bitz lived. So we would have lunch at her place. She would make lunch for us during those 2 or 3 weeks of sister school. And
what kind of things did you do at Bible school?
it was mostly studying the catechism and getting prepared for First Communion, First Confession, for confirmation.
What ages were the students that went?
Right.
What ages were the students that went to school?
From first grade through 8th grade. And once you were confirmed, you didn't go to sister school anymore.
So they called it Bible school, vacation school, and sister school.
It was called, we called it sister school. And then later on it took on the other names.
What was the typical day like at sister school?
All I remember is, it's like, okay, the sister, asking questions about, and reading Bible stories to us and telling us Bible stories, and then memorizing the catechism.
It was only 2 to 3 weeks in the summer then?
Right,
that you would go?
right.
Was that at the end of the school year? Or
That was in June,
okay.
in June. And then during the school year, we would meet after church on Sundays, and then we would have some young women who would take a group of, the priest, Father Greiner, would take the older high school students, and this would all be in church in different parts of the church, and go over the catechism too.
Now, what kind of classes did you participate in that were connected with the church, as far as the ones you just described?
That was it.
That was it?
That was it, right. At home, I think probably I was about the 3rd or 4th grade, 5th grade maybe, when we started taking religious instructions by correspondence. And the lessons would come weekly in the mail, and we would fill out the papers, and then we would return them, and they would be graded and returned again. And then we also were sent books to read, books about the saints or other inspirational books, and we'd read those and we'd send them back. And then we did, my mom subscribed to a children's magazine. I don't even remember it. I haven't thought of it for so long. That we got Manna. Came to mind. The name of it was Manna, and we got that monthly. And it had stories in there about young boys and girls maybe who died young, and the holiness about them, you know, what they were like before they died young, and other stories. So that was sort of a reading.
So did you do a lot of homeschooling then?
That was basically it. But I think I learned more from that experience. Mom and Dad sitting around the kitchen table with us as we were doing those lessons, because Mom and Dad were involved with us then. Whereas when we went to the church and had our Sunday school, you know, Mom and Dad weren't involved, so it helped more when Mom and Dad were involved when we were doing our lessons.
What was Sunday school like?
That's where I was saying, that's where the priest took the older children and went through the catechism with them, and I don't even remember being in his class at all, but then the other older, young women, like high school women or women out of high school, would have catechism classes with us too.
At what ages did you start that?
1st grade, and it was through high school.
Now, what was high school like?
I went away to boarding school, and I was a candidate for becoming a nun, and it was a boarding school and it was also a day school. So as candidates, we were sort of isolated from the rest. We didn't talk with the other day schools, day students, or the other boarding students. But I had some really good teachers in high school.
What was your favorite learning experience there?
I think my favorite class in high school was math, because I had such a good math teacher. But I was not a good math student in grade school, because I didn't have good math teachers, apparently, because I liked math in high school.
What was a typical day like at the boarding school?
We would go to Mass in the morning, and then we'd have breakfast, and then we'd go to school, a regular school day. And then after school hours, we would help with whatever chores that needed to be done, like help peel potatoes for the evening meal for all the boarding students. And then we'd do the dishes afterwards, you know, with the huge dishwasher, commercial dishwasher, that's the word I wanted. And then on weekends, we'd help clean the building.
Now, how many other students were there?
Our class was probably the smallest one, and I think there were about 30 in my class. So I'd say probably about 50 in a class generally.
Now, what was involved in cleaning the building? What exactly did you have to do?
Mopping and dusting, basically, and cleaning bathrooms. Whatever you do to clean the bathroom.
What do you remember best about boarding school?
I think just the classes during one of the election cycles, actually having a campaign and an election, and two people being a campaign leaders for either side, one for the Republican side and one for the Democrat side. So that was a civics lesson. And that's probably where I became really interested in politics, from that experience in high school. And then Latin. I enjoyed Latin. It was something totally different. And then we also had summer school, and summer school having a vocabulary class and learning a lot of words. And so consequently, I'm very attuned to new kind of words and learning new words.
Now, was that taught in German, or was that totally in English?
That was English, right.
What was your favorite holiday?
I think it was Christmas, because we didn't have too many holidays. Easter was pretty close, though, second pretty close. And we were poor, and it was right after the Depression. So we didn't get, I remember only the small children got Christmas gifts, and by the time we were in the 5th grade, there were no more Christmas gifts. So it's just the children who received gifts. And I remember the first year we had a Christmas tree was when I was in the 5th grade. And it was a Charlie, what is it? Anyway, I don't remember with Charlie's Christmas tree. But, and then we didn't wrap up Christmas gifts. It was Santa Claus brought gifts and left them out in front. But a couple of years, I remember, was the German-Russian custom of Christkindl bringing the gifts, or coming into the house, rattling the chain and coming into the house and asking if we were good boys and girls, and then we would get some peanuts, and then he'd leave again. And then by that time, the gifts would be outside, so Santa Claus brought those gifts. So that was fun. But then, like on Christmas Day, we would play with our peanut shells. That was the toys we made out of, the Christmas gifts we didn't get.
Was that typical just because your family was so large?
No, I think that was typical of just the German Russians at that time, and because of the Depression, I think, too, that you didn't get any gifts beyond a certain age. And I think, I don't remember anybody having Christmas trees until then, around the time when we started having our first one.
Do you remember any particular gift that you really liked?
I remember getting a table with chairs, a small child's table with chairs, and I remember that one the best. And then at school, we did do a gift exchange, and I remember, getting a hair bow from somebody in school, and so they were very simple gifts.
Now, did the whole class participate? Was that when you were a younger child?
In country school, right, country school. Mm-hmm.
What was the name of your country school?
It was Starkey School. And the name of it is because that was the schools in that township. There was Starkey Township. And so the school was Starkey School number 1.
Now you mentioned the Starkey Country School. Did your class or did the school do any kind of programs or after-school activities together?
No, no. After school, everybody needed to get home and do chores at home. Yeah, there was no after-school activities.
When you were in high school, did you do any after-school activities there, or was that part of the chores that you did at the sister
It was
school?
chores, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How about gatherings back home? Did your family, perhaps did your mother invite people over often, and what did you do when she did?
There wasn't inviting. People would just sort of come and visit, and we'd go and visit aunts and uncles or mom and dad's friends, and if they had children, we'd go along, and otherwise mom and dad would go. But aunts and uncles came to our place a lot, especially aunts and uncles from town. And then the neighbors would come, and we'd get together with the neighbor kids and play.
Now, when you were growing up on the farm, what did you think about town life?
I don't know that I thought of anything other than that's, we went to sister school when we got to town. We went to church. I remember the first movie I ever went to, because it was a religious movie, so I wanted to go, so I got to go along. But, and then the only other movies were the John Deere Day movies, which were the, sort of like Walt Disney movies. But other than that, there was, nothing particular about town.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would your mother, would she make anything particular when people would come over, or was it the standard meals that your family would usually eat?
Well, they would usually come after a meal, but then she would also have some cake, or if it was in the wintertime, we'd have ice cream. We'd make ice cream, and then we'd have chocolate cake with that, and then we'd serve that, cake and ice cream.
How many cousins did you have?
Oh, lots of them. At least 50, 60. Because Mom had 15 brothers and sisters, and Dad had 7 brothers and sisters, and they all lived around there, so if it wasn't one that was visiting, it was one of the other ones. And
did you often stay with any of them?
No, I don't ever remember staying with any cousins in town.
Did you ever want to?
I don't think it ever occurred to me to stay. Yeah.
I think I'm going to move on to religion a little bit more. I think I want to talk about that a little bit more. What age were you when you were confirmed?
I was in the 5th grade when I was confirmed, and confirmation only took place every 4 years. So I was confirmed in the 5th grade because the next time a bishop would have come for confirmation would have been in high school. And they usually wanted people confirmed before they got to high school. So I was confirmed when I was in the 5th grade.
So you were pretty young then?
Right, right.
Normal.
Yeah.
Confirmations.
And it's really funny, when I made my first communion, which was in the 2nd grade, the thing I remember about that is, we had to wear white stockings, not white socks, white stockings and a white dress and a white veil. Well, my mother and my dad's cousin's wife had decided we would share socks, because they had their first communion one Sunday and we were going to have it the next Sunday. So Sunday morning, my dad drove down to this cousin's place to get the daughter's stockings, so I'd have stockings to wear to church. We shared the stockings.
Did your family celebrate your confirmation or your siblings' confirmations in any way?
There was no reception or anything afterwards, no. And we took pictures afterwards, and I think that's the only picture I have of myself when I was small. Up until until I was in high school, no picture of myself at all. So just that one First Communion picture. Yeah, there was nothing special made of us, because it was First Communion or confirmation.
Did any of your siblings have the same confirmation date as you? Since it was only every other.
My two brothers, Hillary and Fred, who were older than myself.
And what did the confirmation consist of? Can you describe progressed?
I don't remember anything about it, but it would be your typical, bishop confirming.
Now, you mentioned that your parents were a little bit strict with religion. Did they give you free reign on anything at home, or was it pretty,
With regard to religion, or?
With regards to religion, were you always expected to follow the teachings of the church?
Well, I think that was just a given kind of thing. It was not like you'd even think of anything else. The one thing we did do in the morning, we'd all line up and say our morning prayers before breakfast. And that was just a given, but the one thing we did balk at was saying the rosary. We said the rosary every night. We had to kneel on the floor, and we'd lean up against chairs, but if anybody, sat in their hunches, Dad would say, give us a slap and you kneel up for saying the rosary. So that we balked at, because it was every night.
And what was your church name?
St. Philip's Church. And my mother, she had the pious side to her, and she built a shrine to Mary. She made, and my brother Al helped her with that. And then she built a fence around it because there were 4 trees in a square, and so that's where she set her shrine.
What did it look like? Do you remember?
It was a shrine to Mary, and it was like in that cave, or made out of a box, a cove. And I do have a picture of that.
How did your family view other faiths?
I think what was typical at that time was you don't go to anybody else's church, and our church was the best church. That was the typical attitude at that time. And you couldn't get married in anybody else's church, or you weren't a part of the Catholic Church anymore. And you couldn't go to somebody else's church for a wedding. So those were the typical German-Russian experience or attitudes.
Can you describe a typical German-Russian wedding?
Okay, the one wedding that I went to was my aunt's wedding, and I was in the 2nd grade at the time. And what they did is they got married in the morning, and then they served a dinner, and then they danced, and then they served supper, and then they danced some more, and then they served lunch. And that was during my time, and during my mother's time, or earlier, they had 3-day celebrations. But of course, that was not during my time anymore.
Did she ever describe what these 3-day celebrations were like?
I think the 3-day, I think it was the same thing. They prepared food for 3 days, and then people would be there and eat and talk or whatever. But when my mother got married, Mom and Dad got married, it was during the Depression, so then it was really the minimal. In fact, Mom and Dad had a church wedding, and her attendants were there and the parents were there, and then my aunt hosted a wedding dinner for them. So they did not have a big wedding. In fact, not even the whole family was there for the wedding. So that was the bare minimum of a wedding when my mom and dad got married.
Were you ever in any of these weddings yourself?
No, no. Usually what the situation was at that time was the attendants were the godparents. So it was not like young men or women who would be attendants, but adults, godparents would be.
So the wedding party was usually pretty small then?
Right, right. Just the godmother and the godfather of each of the spouses.
Do you remember, did they serve any specific types of food at weddings? Was it?
It was, basically mashed potatoes with coleslaw and chicken. Basically, I think is what it was, and maybe sausage, I think. I don't. And kuchen, wedding kuchen.
What about a wedding cake?
No, they didn't have wedding cakes at that time. Mm-mm.
Now, was it family who would usually cook the meals, or somebody else from outside?
It was usually an aunt that was asked to do it, and that was sort of the big honor for somebody to be the cook for the wedding. But then the night before, people would help prepare, the food, like peel potatoes and cut the cabbage and that kind of thing.
Is that something you ever helped with?
I did with peeling potatoes the night before, right. The honor came in who were inviting young women to be waitresses for the wedding.
So these meals were served by
right.
Members of the family.
Right, and relatives, right.
Let's see, a little bit more about your family. What were you in the lineup of your siblings?
I was third oldest.
As such, did you have a lot more responsibility to take care of your younger siblings?
Mm-hmm. I didn't remember it until the ones who were quite a bit younger, and then it was my sister and I both equally responsible. I liked to help outside more, and she liked to help in the house more. So, and then it was taken care of.
So did you ever help in the fields then?
I didn't. Well, no, just with out in the barn, helping with like getting the cows and milking the cows and cleaning the separator was my job.
What is cleaning the separator? Can you describe it?
It's okay. There was the container, the tank that held where you poured the milk in, and then it would run through this piece of equipment that would separate the milk from the cream. And so after you had done that, after each milking, then you had to wash it so it wouldn't get sour, so it would be clean for the next separating.
How long did that usually take?
About a half hour. I remember one time Dad had us help make haystack. He wanted us to see what real work was like. So my sister and I had to get up on the haystack, and then the boys hauled the hay in, and they pitched the hay up, and then we had to set the haystack so that, and then I learned how to set a haystack at that time.
How old were you then?
probably was about 8th grade.
Was that the last time you went out and helped them?
Yes. Yes.
And it was just you and was it your older sister then?
My younger sister.
Your younger sister.
Uh-huh.
Now, besides haystacking, what were some other things that they would do? Your father would have your brothers do?
Okay. Earlier, when I was younger, I remember there was, and I guess I did help with that too. When it was harvest time, there were different steps to harvesting. First of all, you had to cut the grain, and then you had to come along and bind the grain, pick it up and bind it, and then you had to set those bound shocks, had to set them up so they would dry, and then when it was harvesting time, which was threshing time, then they would come and load those shocks on the hay rack and haul them to the threshing machine, and then they would thresh them. So I remember that. And then when it was threshing time, there would be one neighbor who would own a threshing machine, and then he would make a deal with farmers, like maybe 5 or 6 farmers, that he would do their threshing if they would help threshing everybody else with the threshing. And then when they would come to our place, then Mom would, then we'd help with the meals. Lots of cooking and lots of making morning snacks and lots of making afternoon snacks and evening meals. And we never made breakfast, I don't remember, but the afternoon and the evening meals and snacks in between.
Now, would you serve those at the house, or would you serve them in the field?
The meals were in the house, but the snacks were out in the fields. We had to take those out to the field. And that's the one time. That's the one time I remember Mom buying peaches. Peaches were too expensive, but for the threshers, she would get peaches, and then she'd have pickles, and she'd have kuchens, and I don't know if it were sandwiches. I don't remember that, but bread. I probably think she would take fresh baked bread out there.
Now, what about the meals? What did she usually make for those?
There was like mashed potatoes and chicken and a ham or a roast or
And all the families would usually go out in the field and help one another.
Right, right.
To do this.
Mm-hmm. Any grown-up man, like me, from age 16 on up, would be helping with that.
Let's see, I want to go and kind of talk more about youth activities. When you were younger, did you have any particular, any radio programs that you were particularly fond of? Did you listen to the radio?
We did, and I remember one soap opera called Stella Dallas that we listened to after school hours. And then Dragnet, we listened to that at night. Dad would listen to that, and we'd all listen to that. Lone Ranger, we'd listen to that. And then we'd listen to the polka party on WNAX out of Yankton, South Dakota.
Were any one of those your favorite?
I think not the polka party, was Hoopy John is what it was. That was my favorite one. The music part, yes.
Now, did you ever play any musical instruments growing up?
No, we didn't. We didn't have the money for musical instruments, but my mother's brothers all had a musical instrument that they all got before the Depression, and so they played instruments. But my mom did inherit, or did get, my grandmother's organ, and so we fiddled around with that, trying to play. But my mom, she said the girls in her family didn't play anything because it was a boys' thing. The boys got the privilege, but they all learned how to play by ear.
Now, your mother grew up in a family of how many?
15.
Now, was it your mother's parents who immigrated?
Both of them.
Both
Right,
immigrated.
my dad's parents and my mother's parents. And my dad's parents, everybody in that family had immigrated already except my grandpa, because he was in the Russian army. And then when he decided after he got out of the Russian army he would immigrate, they told him he had to find a wife because there were no women to be had in this country. So he married my grandmother. I suppose he knew her, but and then brought her over here, and she was the only one in her family who came to this country. So she had no family here, but
was that something she ever talked about?
she had sort of a bitterness about that, that she could never go back and never saw her parents again. Well, her father, because her mother had died, but then her father remarried, and she never saw her sister again. And so I think that was just sort of a bad feeling for her that she never got to see them again.
Now, your grandfather, he brought your grandmother over, married her, and then brought her over. Do you remember what year that was they came?
Yes, it was 1900. I think that's right, because my aunt was born in 1902. I think it was 1900.
Now, were these your mother's parents?
My father's parents. My father's parents. My mother's mother came over when she was 2, and they say she learned to walk on the ship. I said, how can you learn to walk on a ship? But she did. And then as far as my grandfather, I don't know how old he was when my mother's father, when he came over to this country. I haven't done enough family tree yet in that side.
Now, did your grandmother, your paternal grandmother, did she ever tell you any stories about the times before she left?
No, she didn't. She didn't. We found out more stories about her afterwards when we met the relatives in Germany. And that's a story in itself. My grandmother had a sister, and then before the war, they lost all connection. Before the war, they were sending food and things like that, and then afterwards they lost track of them. And then when my brother went to Germany, another man from home was a soldier in Germany, and he was a guard for the prisons. And there was this one prisoner that he was guarding, and this man from home could speak German, so they spoke German. And this relative from home said, I'm from North Dakota. And this man said, we have relatives in North Dakota. Oh yeah, what's their name? Their name is Bitz. And this man from North Dakota says, I know some Bitzes. In fact, my cousin is married to a Bitz. So they exchanged names, and then we found out that we are related. This is my dad's first cousin. So we knew they were alive, and then afterwards, when my brother went to Germany, he looked up this aunt of my dad's, and he went to find her. No, this was the other man yet. He went to look for this woman, my dad's aunt, and he found the town, and he knocked on the door of the house, and she thought, oh, here's a soldier coming. They had this experience of soldiers coming and dragging them away. And then he said, he's a relative from North Dakota. And then, oh my gosh. And then when my brother was over there, my brother met her, and she says, now I can die. I saw Magdalena's grandchild. Now I can die. And then afterwards, they came over to visit us, and we went over to visit them. But that's the stories. And I said I could see why my grandmother was sort of had this bitter pill in her, mouth about not seeing family again.
And that was your grandmother's sister.
Right,
That you,
right.
That you saw.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And was she younger or older than your grandmother?
I think she was younger. I think she was younger.
Now, did you ever visit her yourself?
I didn't. She died before we had a chance, but then her daughter, they came to the U.S. and then we went and visited them in Germany.
Let's see here. I want to transition to maybe some of the traditions that your family may have taken from their Germans from Russia heritage. Do you remember any traditions in particular that were important to your family?
I think other than the weddings that we talked about and name days, we'd celebrate name days more so than birthdays, and especially the grown-up men's name days. And then of course we'd get a lot of company, and then you'd serve a lot of food. Potato salad, German potato salad, and that's a tradition. I don't think we tasted anything other than German potato salad until we were, in high school, I think. That's the only kind of potato salad we ever had.
Now, what exactly was name day?
Okay, my dad's name was Matthias, so and there were different saints whose canonization days were celebrated on certain days. So like February 25th was St. Matthias Day. And so we would celebrate, that was Dad's namesake. And so we would celebrate his name day on that day, feast day of St. Matthias.
You had quite a few in your family then.
Yes. The kids' names weren't celebrated. We didn't have company coming, but it was the grown-ups mostly that name days were celebrated.
Well, how old were you the first time you were able to celebrate your name day?
We never did. Because I went away to boarding school, and so it was almost like when you had your own home, I think, is when you celebrated your your name day.
That's interesting. So did you really even celebrate birthdays at all?
We did. We just said happy birthday. We didn't have cakes or anything until later on again. The younger ones had birthday cakes, but we didn't, the older ones of us, we didn't even do that.
Well, any other traditions that you want to discuss?
Well, I can't think of any right now.
Well, I know you mentioned Kris Kringle. Was it Kringle?
Kris Kindle, yeah.
Kindle.
Mm-hmm.
Name days. We'll just go to some of our concluding remarks.
Okay.
What was your most stressful childhood experience?
I think it probably was in school, and it's the typical thing that happens in school now too. Girls sort of isolating each other. One day somebody would be friends with me, and the next day they wouldn't. And isolate me and wouldn't play with me. So it's that kind of, playing kids against each other. That was one of the most stressful experiences that I remember. And then, of course, there was always lots of bickering between siblings.
What about your happiest memory? Your happiest childhood memory?
I think it was celebrating Easter, celebrating Christmas. Easter was fun because it was springtime. We'd, dye Easter eggs and pretend that there was an Easter bunny, for the younger kids. And it's like we had to dye the eggs in secret because we didn't dye the eggs because the Easter bunny, how could he bring them if we dyed them? So the Easter bunny brought the Easter eggs. And I remember, the first time I remember when I still believed in the Easter bunny, all of a sudden, Easter Sunday morning, there were eggs all over the yard out there. So that was a bit a memory.
What was the most adventurous thing you did during your childhood?
I didn't do too many adventurous things, but I know everybody else in the family did. I remember one time, I was showing you that picture earlier, we had this lake down the hill from where the farmstead was, or at least there was water in there in spring after the snow runoff. And when Mom and Dad were in town, the boys took an old barn door down to the lake, and we had cousins out at the farm at that evening, and they went rafting with that. And that was a verboten thing, it was forbidden, but that was, adventuresome experience for them. Of course, Dad found out about it the next morning, and it was a licking. Because they could have drowned in there. It was deep enough to drown.
Did they float?
They floated. They had to use a pitchfork or something to push themselves along, but they floated.
Were you there watching? Were you and your other siblings watching?
No, I wasn't. I was taking care of the little kids.
Being responsible.
Right, right.
One more final question. Is there anything else about your childhood memories you would like to add?
Nothing in particular. Yeah, there was one time. I was confirmed in 5th grade, so I didn't go to sister school anymore, 6th grade, 7th grade, then 8th grade. So the first summer that I didn't go to summer school, sister school, I had to stay home when Mom and Dad took the rest of the kids to sister school. And I was sitting at the kitchen table as they were driving away, and there I saw my little brother standing on the back of this car. It was a Ford, I don't remember what make anymore, but you couldn't see him from the windows. And so I thought, oh my gosh, they're driving off with my little brother standing on the back, hanging on to whatever he was hanging on to. So I ran out and ran after Dad, and luckily he saw me in the rearview mirror or the side mirror, and he stopped. And then of course he took this little, I think he was about 3 years old, maybe 4 years old, and so of course he took him off and gave him a licking. So I remember that. And I thought, well, it's a good thing I didn't go to sister school. What would have happened if I had been going to sister school? So.